Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us and taking time in your busy schedule to hear about the college's marketing policy changes. My name is Melanie Gernoux, and I'm the Deputy Registrar at the college, and I'm pleased to introduce Elaine Van Osten, Practice Advisor, who will be co-presenting, and Ilana Siu, Executive Assistant and Registration Coordinator,
has joined the meeting.
Supporting us behind the scenes today. So just a quick note that this is a regular WebEx meeting, and so to please mute your line if you haven't already done so, so we don't have any feedback. The webinar is being recorded, and we hope that it'll be a valuable resource for dietitians in private practice and others for whom marketing is an important aspect of practice. You'll see we'll put a link on the QA page of our website. We'll focus the presentation today on the review of the 4 new policy documents, and there will be time for questions at the end. And that said, as you think about your questions, feel free to write them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. Next slide, please. Thanks, Ilana. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that the CDBC and staff work on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, represented today by the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And while we're meeting virtually today, I'd like to take a moment to recognize Turtle Island, which we each call home under different names now. And during this week of truth and reconciliation, land acknowledgement is a small step that we can take to reaffirm our commitment and our responsibility to reconcile and improve relationships among nations. Next slide, please. I'd also like to acknowledge our team, who each had a role in helping Elaine and me put these new policy documents together, and would also like to take the opportunity to thank the UBC Pharmacy leadership and dietetics practicum students who contributed their insight, research, and writing skills to each of these documents. Next slide, please. As social media and virtual practice have become normal spaces for providing nutrition care, the college realized that the policy that we had on marketing, sales, and conflict of interest no longer met the expectation in this area of dietetic practice. And as we reviewed our old policy, we realized that dietitians needed more detail than what was provided in our bylaws in the marketing section, and also what was available in the policy. And so that's why we're presenting 4 documents instead of only 1. And as we go through the session today, our hope is that it will also count as a learning activity that you can choose to report on in your CCP. And if you go to the next slide, Ilana, our goal is that you'll be able to answer these questions by the end of the session. So how did we go about deciding what went into the document? Why did we do it? Why now? How does these resources fit within the legal framework for dietetic regulation in BC, and where you can find the different resources on the website and how it might impact your practice. Next slide, please. So more specifically, we're going to go over a description of how these were developed. And although we don't have a formal policy development framework at the college, we've definitely started with this project to follow principles of policy development and develop a more robust process to make sure that we're balancing the interests of the public that we serve with the registrant's needs for practice. And so at the onset of the project, I think I hear some background noise. If people can please mute their lines as I'm talking, that would be much appreciated. We are recording the session. And so we did do an environmental scan of existing resources in dietetics and also in other health regulatory organizations, as well as a literature search. And we've referenced the ones that we looked at, reviewed, and drew from in the references of each of the documents that we've developed. The process definitely benefited, and I would say it was fast-tracked thanks to the UBC Practicum students' insight. They do have the best pulse on the latest social media trends, and so it was a very helpful thing to have their view on this as we developed each of the policy documents. And we're also very thankful to have had the opportunity to do 2 rounds of consultation with volunteer dietitians. Mainly, we consulted with private practice dietitians and also advisory dietitians in our regulatory counterparts around the country. And I would say the most innovative step for us as part of this project was to be able to, through Joannie's insight and communications, consult with the BC Public Advisory Network. And so this network was founded thanks to the leadership of the College of Physicians and Surgeons, the College of Nursing and Midwives, and I believe also Physical Therapists of BC. The goal of the BC Public Advisory Network is to encourage a comprehensive and meaningful public engagement on issues related to healthcare regulation in BC. The network is composed of 16 public advisors who each have varying levels of experience interacting with regulated healthcare professionals, and its composition is representative of the diversity of the BC population. And so for this project, Joanie networked with our regulatory counterparts in BC, and representatives were asked to provide feedback on conflict of interest in sales, testimonials, and just general expectations around practice and marketing, and how they felt about that. We also, of course, had several rounds of review of each document with the Quality Assurance Committee before the documents were approved by our board. And finally, we took an additional step over the summer, hiring a consultant to review each of the documents to make sure that it met principles of equity, diversity, inclusion, and also accessibility, which is aligned with our strategic plan for the next couple of years. Next slide, please. So here we provided you a summary table to highlight the key insights that came through the BC Public Advisory Network consultation, where you can see what these public representatives thought were expected from dietitians and regulated professionals as a whole, because they do talk about, all BC regulated health professions when they meet. And so compassionate support, trust, receipt of knowledgeable care, and having access to honest interactions were definitely at the forefront of their expectations. And things that people felt they feared or they would complain about were things such as seeing non-factual information, being deceived, feeling pressure to buy something or to leave a testimonial, or being taken advantage of. And so we can echo that at the college, where evidence-informed publications and feeling pressure, to act a certain way, to stay within a therapeutic relationship, those are pressures that drive some of the complaints that we get from the public. And so, the other thing that we considered when we received that feedback was the fact that we have a responsibility as a college to support dietitians and provide clarity in this area of practice, which we knew at that point was no longer adequate. And so this is why we'll talk about a position statement for testimonials and some social media guidelines, which were asks from registrants in recent years. Next slide, please. So Just before we get into the meat and potatoes of today's topic, I wanted to also kind of talk about a bit of what's been going on around the country in terms of marketing and case law. And so given that so much of private practice is now undertaken on social media and virtually in general, especially since the beginning of the pandemic, it's really important to note that any activity online by a dietitian or generally as a health regulated professional can be regarded as marketing. And so what I mean by that is that, while the marketing bylaws are not new, the amount of visibility to marketing has increased dramatically since our bylaws were written in the early 2000s. And it's really where professional boundaries and ethical conduct meet with marketing, where online presence is concerned, and where visibility is considered to be 24/7. So even though you may have a professional and a personal presence, people might still perceive what you do online as a regulated health professional. And so in Canada, there is case law that supports health regulators to look at complaints where off-duty conduct could be thought to undermine the profession or put the public interest at risk. And we'll talk about that in greater detail
has joined the meeting
as we go throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. All right, so before we look at the marketing standards, I thought it would be helpful to take a look at the relationship between the legal framework for dietetics and the standards, policies, guidelines, and resources that we publish to support that. Some of you may have seen a similar graphic in a Ministry of Health presentation, and this is an adaptation of the same graphic. And so in general, where health regulation is concerned, federal laws articulate governance of its various entities. And this is often mirrored in provincial laws for areas of society where provinces have jurisdiction. So for example, health. And so as an example of a federal law that we would look to, privacy comes to mind. And so privacy legislation at a federal level pertains to their entities. So for example, in correctional services, the privacy legislation that applies is the federal one. But in that legislation, there is a clause to give precedence to provincial privacy legislation where it exists. And so you would go down one level for privacy in BC and refer to BC's Freedom of Information and Protection Act and the Privacy Protection Act. And so two federal laws that we thought were important to focus on today in the context of marketing, which don't really have provincial equivalents, are the Canada Anti-Spam legislation, which we'll talk about in the marketing standards, and the Cannabis Act, where dietitians can't really market anything regarding cannabis. However, that act doesn't prevent dietitians from talking about it from a scientific review perspective. And so we have a Q&A to support dietitians on that topic in the Have a Practice question of our website. So you're welcome to take a look at that later. And so as we go down the pyramid, as you well know, provincially, the Health Professions Act is the umbrella legislation that governs our practice as dietitians. And Section 19 is the section that gives CDBC the authority to make bylaws to regulate and prohibit advertising and marketing or types of advertising and marketing by registrants. And so from there, if you go down to the next level, this is where the college develops and publishes the various support pieces that provide interpretation to the bylaws. We'll take a closer look at how the new marketing documents fit within this structure shortly. But the last point I wanted to talk about here is how, in the context of our conversation today, in private practice, we recognize that the next level is a bit complex because the relationship between scope and what you do for marketing may be challenge because as a private practitioner, you might be self-employed, and so you could be wearing both the owner hat and the employer hat if you hire other dietitians in the scope of your private practice, while also being a registrant with your own individual scope. So I just want us to keep that in mind as we go through the conversation today. So next slide, please. So thinking about the college level and what happens here and the relationship among the different resources and policy documents that we develop, we thought this graphic would be helpful to show the relationship among the documents that we have and sort of the importance that each one takes. And so you can see standards are sort of the first layer after the bylaws that come into play. Those are mandatory requirements for competent, ethical, and safe practice, and they are usually measurable, which distinguishes them from the other policy pieces. And so in our context today, that would be the marketing standards. And then we go into policies, which identify either a problem and a scope, tells us which action needs to be performed in a certain way. And the policies are based on principles, values, and rationales that support legislation requirements. So often policies at our college will provide more detail than what is outlined in our bylaws.
Has joined the meeting.
They provide an interpretation piece. And so in our case today, you'll want to think about the conflict of interest and sales policy, and the testimonial position statement are considered policy documents. And then we go into guidelines, which are a little bit worded more softly. They provide additional practice guidance. They're based on the best available evidence and regulatory requirements of the day. And an example that we'll look at are the social media guidelines. And then we have resources such as the question and answer that our practice advisory staff write to further support all of these policy documents and provide concrete practice examples for dietitians. So hopefully that gives you a better idea of how each of these are interrelated. And the only other comment I would say with regard to guidelines is that often we perceive guidelines as being optional. And I would say that this is not necessarily the case for health regulation, where guidelines are regarded as being rooted in current best practice and contributing to the mandate of promoting high practice standards amongst registrants. So I wouldn't necessarily discount all of them. You will need to look at them with some judgment to see, where they might be originating from, and distinguishing between those that might be completely optional, where you're not putting anyone at risk if you don't apply them, versus the ones that talk about maybe current best practice or are rooted in ethics. And so I'll put that here for us to think about. And on that note, I'll now pass the mic to Elaine, who will take a deep dive into all of the different documents. Elaine, back to you.
Thanks, Mel. Ilana, could I have the next slide, please? So as we approach these 4 documents, I just want to point out a couple of key definitions that we find are thread through all 4. The first one is a marketing definition, and this definition is set in bylaw. It needs to be accurate, true, and not misleading. From our definition, we can see that advertising is part of marketing. Any publication or communication in any medium with a client, the public, or a prospective client is considered marketing. So it's really important to recognize that anything going on social media is considered a form of marketing. Secondly, it's really important to understand the difference between a recommendation and an endorsement. This is critically important for interpreting all 4 of the new published documents. The image that you see on the right-hand side of the screen occurs in the marketing standards, and it's also repeated in the social media standards. And from a practical point of view, recommendation and endorsement are both promotion of evidence-based products or services that you may be selling or recommending in your practice. A recommendation has no personal or financial gain, whereas an endorsement stands to advance career, increase public recognition. Perhaps you're benefiting by receiving a gift or a discount, or there will be personal or financial gain. So please keep those definitions in mind as we go forward. And the next slide will have a conflict of interest definition. So a conflict of interest occurs when a dietitian's interests interfere with the dietitian's professional responsibilities. A conflict of interest can occur almost anywhere in any practice setting, and it's not specific to private practice. It can be real, potential, or perceived, and it can erode trust in the therapeutic relationship between the dietitian and their client. The last definition slide I want to go over is one that includes definitions for solicitation and testimonial. It's important as we go through these definitions to include that these define actions that are not permitted by dietitians. So in this situation, a solicitation is initiated by the registrant with the purpose of forging a therapeutic relationship. Solicitation is not client-centered. It benefits the dietitian in furthering their career and practice. It's also noted that solicitation is strictly guided by anti-spam legislation, which, as Mel mentioned, is a federal law in Canada. So when a dietitian reaches out to try to initiate a therapeutic relationship, this is considered solicitation. Or when a client doesn't reach out to make a follow-up appointment and there's a loss to follow up and the dietitian reaches out to request if the client would like to reestablish the therapeutic relationship, this is also considered solicitation. Solicitation is not planned follow-up of an existing client. That's important to note. And I'll leave you with this. Consider how you feel when someone knocks on your door or calls your phone with a spam cold call to try to sell you something. That's solicitation. So from a testimonial perspective, and I know this one, there are some registrants using testimonials, so this is an important aspect. A testimonial is a published personal statement from a client about the services they've received from a dietitian. And this published statement would be on the dietitian's platforms used in their marketing somehow. It can include before and after photography. The considerations here are: consider how a client might feel about being requested to recommend or provide a testimonial, We'll go through the testimonial position statement in a future slide. So we'll talk about all of the kind of cons associated with testimonials and why we have chosen the position that we have going forward with the college. So let's dive into the first document. The first document are the marketing standards. There are 3 standards, and going forward, thinking about these 3 standards, it's really important to remember in the back of your mind the definition of marketing as it's written in bylaw, as pretty much any advertisement or anything you could possibly publish in your social media. So these are in bylaw and required legal practices. So the marketing standards aim to clarify the expectations of marketing and advertising conduct that have existed since the inception of the college. And this document exists to make these expectations more widely understood in the context of private practice. So let's look at the 3 standards. Standard 1, dietitians are responsible for marketing over which they have control. Underneath this standard, you can see a couple of bullet points that are some points of consideration for you. So is your marketing clear and legal? Are you correcting mistakes where possible? Do you have consent before contacting clients, either marketing to them or offering a new service? Again, solicitation is not permitted. So you can't solicit clients past or potential. Members of the public should always initiate contact. Understanding that you need to have your marketing on file for 1 year in the event that CDBC asks for it. And again, understanding the difference between endorsement and a recommendation. This includes using the principles of Ad Standards Canada influencer marketing, such as the appropriate use of disclosure, hashtags to be transparent and to reduce the potential for conflict of interest. You'll note that the difference between recommendation and endorsement is going to come up a whole lot in the coming slides. So moving on to standard 2 of 3, dietitians must be truthful and ethical in their marketing. Are you marketing products or services that are outside of dietetic scope? Are you making sure that your marketing is true, honest, and verifiable? This is where the code of ethics and bylaws come into play and combine with the marketing standards. Do you understand which laws are governing you? And this goes back to what Mel mentioned about things like the Federal Cannabis Act, the anti-spam legislation, and those kinds of things that sort of supersede provincial law that will apply to you. Are you endorsing a product that that is not evidence-based? Avoiding taking advantage of any member of the public in any capacity is critical in this situation. Are you offering options for sale? So, for example, if you happen to be partnered with a company and you have a contractual obligation when partnering with this company where you are only allowed to endorse one product, it's really important to note that that contractual obligation does not supersede the college's expectations of you. So you must offer more than one option for sale. Avoiding implying guarantees, avoiding comparison of yourself with other health professionals and how you can provide a service different, better, faster, cheaper than they can. This standard also includes not allowing testimonials, and in our bylaws, we also do not allow a multi-level marketing scheme. So you can't associate yourself with a company where there is multi-level marketing going on. Avoiding the use of the term specialist, as it is a term that is reserved for physicians. Instead, you can use terms such as focus on or expert in, as well as avoiding speaking on behalf of the college, including avoiding use of the college logo. So moving on to standard 3, our last standard in the marketing standards, dietitians must provide clear and informative content in their marketing. Is your title accurately stated, including your credentials, any restricted activities you have, education, diplomas or certificates? Is it easily understood, current, factual, and evidence-based marketing that you're providing? And when you are stating your fees, is it a clear description of the services or products you're offering, including any sort of cancellation or any other type of fee that you might be incurring? So that brings us to the end of the 3 marketing standards, and we'll dive right into the conflict of interest in sales policy, keeping in mind that if you do have questions, please do put them in the chat function or write them down for use at the end of this presentation. So the conflict of interest in sales policy has 4 points in it. And before we delve into those 4 points, it's really important to remind yourself the definition of conflict of interest, that it can be potential, real, or perceived. This conflict of interest in sales policy explains the legal requirement in bylaw in a little bit more usable detail. And as Mel mentioned, it replaces a former marketing conflict of interest in sales policy that was quite broad and not specific enough for practical use in this day and age with social media. So let's look at the 4 points in this policy. Policy point 1 is disclosing and mitigating any potential real or perceived conflict of interest. And again, there are some points here to question yourself as you go through this presentation. Do you benefit from any partnerships that you have in your practice? You should recognize where conflict of interest could arrive. And if you're having questions about whether there's conflict of interest, you can refer to the decision tool for new aspects of practice, which is on the quality assurance page, as well as the code of ethics, which you can find there and under bylaw as well, to determine how to handle any situations that you're coming across. Knowing again the difference between a recommendation and an endorsement as defined in a previous slide is really key here. And if you encounter a conflict of interest that can't be avoided, you should disclose the conflict of interest to your client and offer alternative services and products, so that way you can avoid that conflict of interest and hand that client over to someone else if possible. If it's not possible, you need to disclose your industry relationships that you have. And if you're working for a manager or employer, it's important to inform them. Also key to note here is our record keeping standards. It's really important to document any conflict of interest that you encounter, such that if there is a complaint made against you that's related to conflict of interest, you have appropriate documentation that the college can request from you. So policy point 2 of 4 is practicing objectively to provide evidence-based information. So are you following best practices in your recommendation? Are you requesting the clients to provide a testimonial? Because as we mentioned in a previous slide, the testimonial position statement coming up will provide rationale as to why we will be banning those. Are you following social media guidelines? Well, how can you know right now at this point in the presentation, because we haven't gotten there and they are coming up, but these are all key points to keep in mind as you move forward through this policy. So policy point 3 is practicing transparently when providing services and selling products and services. It's really important that the therapeutic relationship should not be dependent on the sale of a product or service. So clients need to be guaranteed that they're going to get the same level of good quality care with evidence-informed recommendations for them, whether or not they are purchasing your products or services. So in this situation, clients need to have the right to decline a purchase, to seek alternative options, seek a second opinion, comparing cost or delaying purchase, including the alternative that includes the alternative to decline the purchase altogether. Are you combining counseling and sales? This seems like a really obvious one, but I do think that there are probably a lot of practitioners out there who counsel and sell products they either have developed or that they are endorsing as part of a partnership with industry. So separating those is really important because if you counsel and sell a product, that can be seen as a conflict of interest. Do your clients understand the cost of the products that you're offering? So you need to be sure you're selling them at market value and that your clients are aware of that they are being disclosed the cost, the rebate that you might be getting, an expiry, and any additional costs or rebates that you are passing on to them. So policy point 4 of 5, separating professional practice from personal lifestyle endeavors. Mel had touched on this earlier. Because when you use your title in a professional practice, you should be practicing dietetics and avoiding it when you are not. Are you linking your professional and personal endeavors? This includes any side hustles that you might have. If you have another business that you're using online platform for sales, you need to make sure that you are avoiding connecting the two, your professional and your personal side hustle accounts. So that includes no linking, no hashtagging, and anything that could connect the two profiles together. So those are the 4 policy points. Sorry, I think I may have said 5 back there, but I meant 4. We're going to move on to the testimonial position statement. This is a brand new position statement, and it is important as we go forward for you to understand the definition of testimonial as we discussed in a previous slide. And in the testimonial position statement, we do have 4 reasons why we're not permitting testimonials. I will briefly discuss them now, and I'm sure that they will garner some conversation and some questions that we will save for the end of this webinar. So number 1, sorry, lost my notes here. Number 1, no, sorry, I have lost my notes, pardon me. Number 1, consider inherent selection bias. Be transparent. 100% of testimonials, good and bad. Oh, can you go back one? No, can you go back one, please? Thank you. To be transparent, 100% of testimonials, good and bad, would have to be published. Why would you as a dietitian be motivated to publish bad testimonials when you're able to cherry pick only the good ones? This isn't representative of a client's experience. Number 2, risk of blurring professional boundaries. The patient could think to themselves, is my care going to be compromised if I don't supply a testimonial? Or will my care improve if I do supply a testimonial? And that is not a nice position to be putting members of the public and clients in when they are looking mostly for transparency, as Mel mentioned in a previous slide. Huge trust issues can arise with this. Number 3 is misleading the public. Giving them a false impression of potential effects of your nutrition care could arise with things like before and after photography of weight loss or health improvement. It goes back to the marketing standards, which we talked about, which indicate that dietitians need to refrain from guaranteeing outcomes. And number 4 is the risk of privacy breach. So you may be at risk of violating privacy of your clients if your client is recognizable in a testimonial, especially in a before or after photography by another member of the public. So many of you are wondering, well, I use testimonials, so I'm not actually sure what to do with this information now. Please rest assured that this is going to be in force starting April 1st, 2022. So that gives registrants a lot of time to review their social media platforms and any marketing that they have to ensure that testimonials are avoided. So we will move on to our fourth document, pardon me, social media guidelines. There are 5 guidelines in the new social media guidelines here that we have never had before. And as Mel mentioned, because there is such an onslaught of people using social media for professional and personal use, it's really important for us to develop these guidelines, and they have been a long time coming and have been requested by you. So they have been published and we will go through all 5 of them. It's important to understand the difference between endorsement and recommendation, as I'm hitting you over the head with that hammer. They are, as Mel mentioned, guidelines can be seen often as something that is recommended to follow, but it is important to note that some of these guidelines have roots in bylaw. And I will point out that the Code of Ethics is also in bylaw. And so ethical considerations do need to be made here when you are considering every single social media interaction. Social media is a form of marketing in a space that is widely thought of as a popularity contest, when dietetics is really not a popularity contest. So as registrants, we have a code of ethics we must abide by, and these have helped us at the college to inform the following social media guidelines, just as they should help you inform you when you're considering each social media encounter. So it's also important to note that personal accounts and professional accounts, as Mel mentioned, are both going to be included in these social media guidelines. So if you are a personal social media user, these also apply to you. One level of protection as a personal profile is to strictly have really high privacy controls on your account to help one extra level of protection from public view. So let's look at the 5 social media guidelines. Number 1, being aware of boundary issues and potential blurring of therapeutic relationships. Are your personal and professional accounts separate? You should be separating them and using professional language on all your social media. Maintaining professional boundaries by avoiding creation of online client connections with your personal account. You should also strive to avoid provision of client-specific advice in a public forum. That is to say, if you do pursue a therapeutic client relationship, you should take that offline and connect personally, one-on-one, professionally with that new client, and avoid posting on a public forum personalized client information. The same standards will apply, standards and policies will apply to one-to-one dietetic care in this situation. Social media guideline 2, avoiding compromising client care. Consider of the perception of your liking, following, commenting on another comment or post of another professional page. Consider how that looks to a member of the public in terms of perhaps it looks like you're recommending or endorsing a product for sale. And so clients look to you as a there's a hierarchy there. They're looking to you for excellent client care. And if you start liking and posting about all kinds of other things that are unrelated to dietetics, that could be seen as a conflict of interest and compromising the therapeutic relationship. Disclose when you're endorsing versus recommending a product and offer more than one option for sale. An interprofessional referral is not defined as an endorsement. So some of you might wonder, how do you refer between one professional and another without appearing as though you're endorsing or recommending if you're doing that? And please know that that is not defined as an endorsement. Be transparent and fully disclose when you are endorsing and recommending options for sale. Reflect on Ad Standard Canada guidelines for disclosure, including upfront and unambiguous disclosures at the outset of the post, appropriately understood hashtags about specific brands and products and the nature of their connection, as well as disclosing the nature of your connection to your partnerships. So social media guideline 3 is being responsible and respectful in all communications. So this is to do with professionalism, and I want you to consider when you are posting in social media, consider how professional you are being, maintaining your relationships with other members of the healthcare team who contribute to healthcare delivery, removing any content that can be perceived as unprofessional, such as drug or alcohol impairment, opinions about colleagues, employers, the college, the dietetics profession in general, as well as personal social media pages that could damage reputations. Ensuring that your content is accurate and data informed as of the date of publication, and recognize that it takes time, obviously, to upkeep these things. As all of you know, it takes a lot of time to keep current and make sure that your posts are evidence informed and as relevant as possible. So it's also important to use a disclaimer to make sure that you state clearly that your post is not meant to replace individualized dietetic advice. Social media guideline 4 is considering conduct, context, and content when posting to social media. Have you posted anything that you wouldn't want everyone online to access? Consider that anything online could be public and it could be permanent, including things that are going on behind you while you're live streaming. That kind of considerations also need to be taken into account. Consider you're balancing your informality with professionalism when you use things like emojis. A lot of us are emoji users online, which is great for lending informality, but consider the content that you are conveying and make sure that it's still being conveyed in a professional manner. Are you interacting with clients online in a manner that does not divulge their client status without their explicit consent? This was an interesting one that was actually brought back to us from our consultation process and provided an interesting point of discussion at the college. We talked a little bit about it because it is very easy to accidentally divulge that you have a client if you are interacting with them in a way that discloses to other members of the public that you are seeing them in private practice. And so a client could very well take offense to that, and rightfully so. So ensure that you have explicit consent in the way that you are interacting with your clients and the public online. Are you representing any personal views using your dietitian title? You should refrain from using your title when you are talking about personal views. As well, I want to just point out some external comments that you might be getting from trolls on your pages. Be aware of these defamatory comments about your practice and whether or not you can change them. In most cases, we can't, but in some cases, you may be able to take some action. As well, you have no control over unsolicited reviews. They are obviously permitted because they are client has initiated them. However, you may not link your social media to this review, as this would be considered a testimonial. The last point I want to make about this guideline is that the Health Professions Act outlines the duty of regulated health professionals to report unprofessional conduct of another health regulated professional. So if you see other professionals that are using unprofessional conduct online, it is your duty to report that to their college. The last guideline I want to touch on is one that's, I would consider it, Mel, you can stop me if I'm wrong here. It's kind of a nice to have. It's something that if you have lots of time and energy, you can dedicate yourself to considering developing a code of conduct or social media policy for your online practice. The circumstances that might precipitate this is if you find yourself grappling with how to handle social media situations and you want a defined decision support tool to help you out with that. Or if you have staff that you're employing or staff that you're actually working on the same level and you need guidance, you need proper guidance to be able to make sure that you're all following the same expected conduct on social media. So you may actually think about considering defining what is the purpose of your social media use, what platforms do you approve to be used by your private practice, what the online expectations are, and who can post on behalf of your business, what the confidentiality requirements are, any rules around giving nutrition advice online within the context of what we've just discussed, of course. And how do you deal with public relations issues, including trolls? So if you have a code of conduct or a social media policy within your private practice, you can streamline these activities so that you present to the public a streamlined and defined way of dealing with them. So that's the end of the social media guidelines. And the next slide will show where these can be found online. Oh, sorry, that's the slide before. Thank you, Ilana. I want to show you a visual here of how all of these 4 documents all connect to each other. They're designed to provide more detail on the broader statements of the CDBC bylaws, including the code of ethics and the standards of practice, and should be used collaboratively as they refer to each other with crossover content in multiple instances, as we have just seen. So where can you find these documents? These documents are available on our website. If you can go to the next slide, please, Alana. So on the website, we have a new to us website, which is probably about 1.5 years old now. We have had some feedback from you as registrants as to some difficulty finding content. So I wanted to point out where you can find these 4 documents. When you go to the home page, the top banner has the word registrants along it. If you select that, you get a drop-down menu where you can select the quality assurance page. All 4 documents are posted there, roughly in hierarchical order, but also alphabetical order. So have a look and see if you can find them there. And if you have any difficulty, of course, you're welcome to reach out. The next slide shows where the Have a Practice Questions section of the website is found. It's also under registrants, the drop-down menu to have a practice question. And there are 3 sets of question and answers that we have published that will enhance your understanding, hopefully, or answer some of your questions regarding these 4 documents. Any questions that are asked today that are not addressed in these Q&As may be developed into an additional Q&A in one of these publications. And we would let you know about that through an upcoming monthly update. The last page to navigate the website you may find helpful is at the bottom of the quality assurance page. So you go to registrants and then quality assurance program, where you find at the very bottom, you may find the private practice resource. And then that is also where our webinar that we are recording right now will be published after it's over today. So of course, you can always be in touch for questions to navigate difficult, sticky conflict of interest situation, a difficult, sticky marketing situation that you're in. And now we wanted to open up the floor to questions.
Thanks, Elaine, for a really comprehensive review. We do have quite a few questions in the chat, so I think I'll just read them and then you and I can decide how we'll answer. And so the first one comes from Kara, asking about email listservs where potential clients opt in to receive information about your practice. Just to confirm, is sharing information about services there considered solicitation? And then kind of a side question on the same topic, on a social media following where someone has independently decided to follow you, sharing services available, is that considered solicitation as well? I don't know if you want me to take that.
Would you like me to? I'll take it. So an email listserv where clients opt in, I think that's governed by the anti-spam legislation, which is a federal law. And I believe the requirements include the ability to unsubscribe at any time without consequence. So the answer to your first question is no, that's not considered solicitation. The second one, it's in a similar vein in that it is consent provided by a social media user to follow you. So you have not reached out, you're just putting your information out in space and people can choose to follow you, and that's under their own steam and they can unfollow you at any time. So no, neither of those is considered solicitation.
Okay, and as a seg, and I think you just answered the second question, are social media posts in general about your services solicitation? I think no, they are marketing, but not solicitation, where people are free to look at them or not. And then as a follow-up question, what about Google reviews? Elaine, I think you touched on that briefly.
I did. Google reviews are public initiated, so we often can't control those as practitioners. Maybe we can't control them at all. The only thing I will say is you're not able to link to a good review and post it on your social media platform because that would be considered a testimonial. But Google reviews are fine. They are initiated by the public.
Great. And then we have a more of a practice specific question with regard to contacting clients that are a no-show. One of the dietitians, Elise, works in a medical clinic where the office assistant will make a phone call when a patient doesn't show up. And so wondering if this is against the marketing standards for the office assistant to follow up with the patient.
Sorry, I'm going to let you answer that one because I was lost in thought reading a couple above that we haven't responded to yet. I'll let you take that one, Mel.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, so, again, I think if there's an existing relationship, the assumption is that the client consented to have the appointment with a dietitian. And so as part of that relationship, having the ability to follow up for a no-show wouldn't be considered against the marketing standard. It wouldn't be considered solicitation where the person already has an established therapeutic relationship with you, the dietitian, and then your office staff. So I think that, that's just good practice. And then Maya is asking, what if a client voluntarily gives you feedback and then you ask if it can be shared without any personal identifiers? So I think that's a kind of a testimonial question.
Yeah, that would be considered a testimonial. And I would pose the question of if someone, if a client voluntarily gives you feedback that you were doing a terrible job, you would never ask them or you would never share that without personal identifiers. So this is what I meant when I was saying cherry picking feedback. This is considered a testimonial. And so if you can't equally post the good and the bad, then it's considered cherry picking and is not reflective of all clients' experiences.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that one. It's certainly consistent with the literature that we reviewed on that. And then as another testimonial question, Elise is asking if registrants have to go back and remove any social media posts that may have had testimonials on their feed or just not post any new testimonials moving forward. I think, I don't know, Elaine, what you think about this, you can comment, but I think no, like what we put forward is not retrospective. It starts now as we present this to you, and the board recognized that this will take time and effort from everyone to adjust to the new marketing policy documents. And so as Elaine mentioned, we're not going to take a look at what people are doing until we start the new registration year, recognizing that everybody needs transition time to look at their marketing and adjust it accordingly. So I don't know if you want to add to that or.
Nope, I think that was pretty clear.
All right. Next question. I think that's a duplicate questions. Visanto is wondering if we'll share the slides. We won't share the slides, but we will share the recording. It will be posted on the quality assurance page of our website. And then a follow-up question, may I post on websites comments from participants from presentations that I do internationally? Again, I think that goes back to what Elaine answered regarding testimonials and selection bias.
I would say this is really granular. And so when we get into this kind of detail, if you read the testimonial position statement in detail and you don't get the answer you're looking for, please do reach out to us, because I think it's worth having a one-on-one chat about that.
And Kara asked if we could comment on posting affiliations on a website. I'm not sure what you mean by affiliations. Are we talking about partnerships, sponsorships? I think we need more detail on that one.
I was going to say, if it's a partnership or sponsorship, then disclosure is required. If you, yeah, we would definitely need more information, I think, about that one.
Yeah, and I think we'd provide guidance on the conflict of interest questions that you presented, Elaine, you know, to make sure that any perceived or real conflict of interest is mitigated. That's what I see for this question. And then Angela is asking if we have reason to believe a client is at risk, for example, history of suicidal ideation, can we reach out to them to check in? If, for example, they normally book an appointment and they suddenly stop. That's a question that we've been receiving recently. And so this question is quite complex because it also involves consent and privacy considerations. And so, you know, Angela, for this question, I would encourage you to reach out to our team so we can iron out the details of the therapeutic relationship with a client and what their privacy and consent relationship with you and potentially other health regulated professionals looks like. So in the event where the person, for example, consented for you to have a relationship with their physician, that you might have access to a greater support network to achieve that follow-up. And again, if you have an ongoing therapeutic relationship with that person, that would be considered in the client's interest for you to reach out and see if they need your support. And Elaine, feel free to add to what I just said, knowing that we responded to this recently.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add over and above what you said, Mel. I am noticing that there's a question from Kelsey. Is it possible to unmute people on the phone that have questions and don't have access to the chat? I think that that's a possibility. Shall we get through what's on the chat first and then unmute and see if we get just a barrage of questions?
Yeah, I think so. I think we only have a couple more questions. So why don't we do that? And then we can open it up to the people on the phone. And so one question from Visanto regarding 15 books in 15 languages. What are guidelines about letting clients know? There's a section or chapter there that exactly covers their topic of interest.
It's important to know, Mel, sorry, that it's books written by the professional. I don't know.
Yes, the dietitian is the author in this instance. And so again, you know, there's room for that in marketing. I think without it being considered solicitation or a testimonial, I think just looking at the content.
I agree, because I think what you're doing before you're recommending those chapters in those books is you're doing an assessment. And in your assessment, you have deemed that a chapter in this book specifically may help set the client on the right path as part of a nutrition care plan. I don't see that as an issue. I think that fits in with our conflict of interest in sales policy.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Okay, and we have a question from Miriam about the new standards in general, understanding the ethos of it all, and wondering what happens when dietitians are further removed from the public, are we inadvertently leaving room for holistic nutritionists to fill the space if dietitians are limited to what they can do to market their services to the masses? We've certainly heard a lot of those comments during the consultation, and looking at what other regulators are doing around the country, I can say we're certainly all aligned, and we are not seeing a loss of business for dietitians in private practice and in the virtual realm. In fact, it would be the opposite. There seems to be an increase in demand for virtual dietetics and for this kind of business to grow. And so, I don't think that we want you to be looked at as equal competitors to holistic nutritionists or unregulated nutrition providers, as we like to call them. And so there's an opportunity for dietitians to market their services and distinguish themselves from people who are not regulated and do not have the same level of credibility.
I will add, Mel, Miriam, if you look at question 13 on the marketing and testimonial question and answer on the Have a Practice question section of the website, you will see that this question has been answered in the context of regulated versus unregulated. So have a look at that and see if it satisfies your question.
Okay, so I see there's a lot more questions coming in, but I am mindful that there are people on the phone who would like to ask questions. And so why don't I'll open up the phone lines for those people if they want to contribute to the Q&A. I've sent a request. I believe we have 2 people on the phone.
I just had a question about the conflict of interest and sponsored posts. I know you were talking about this earlier, but I was under the impression that we were allowed to post sponsored posts as long as we very clearly stated that it was sponsored to the public and to clients. Is that still true or no?
I believe, if I'm understanding correctly, it's a partnership between you and a company where you are endorsing a product and required to place a logo or something on your website. I believe that in the social media guidelines, using appropriate disclosure hashtags, appropriate hashtags such as sponsored or hashtag ad, those kinds of things would actually be best practice in that situation. Have I understood the question correctly, Mel, or do you have anything to add?
The only thing I would add is what Elaine talked about earlier, is that when you do that, remember that there's some limitation around focusing on just one option of a type of product, knowing that there's a lot of alternatives out there. And so depending on the context of how that sponsorship works, if you have therapeutic relationships, that you have to provide alternatives to your clients so that they know that, yes, you have that sponsorship or that relationship. However, they can find what they need elsewhere if they need to.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. So state that there's other options and alternatives and just make both of those things clear.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'm seeing Kara's question is very similar to the question we just answered. Shall we keep going through the chat here? Okay. So Elise is asking if dietitians are able to recommend a supplement and make a commission if the patient purchases a product, as long as we disclose the financial gain and offer an alternative. For example, vitamin D that can be purchased anywhere. The answer is yes, as long as you're providing options for sale and you're being upfront and disclosing your partnership with this company, you can avoid and mitigate any conflict of interest or perceived conflict of interest that occurs there.
Yeah, I think we have a question from Jelena. If you've provided a plan to a client and reached out to check in and they have not booked a follow-up appointment, is that considered solicitation if there is no request to book another appointment in follow-up? And so I don't know, Elaine, I think that that's a bit of an interpretation question where, if you've followed up several times and the person doesn't respond, it might mean that the therapeutic relationship needs to close. And so in terms of your private practice, you may want to think of, how many tries will you go to before you consider the therapeutic relationship to be closed? That's certainly, if possible, something that you can discuss with your clients. But I think it would be safe to assume that a person is no longer interested if, after 3 to 5 attempts, they don't return any response. But that's not up to the college to define what that looks like.
I will add that it would be important for your documentation to document that you've attempted a follow-up that was unsuccessful.
Yep. And then we have a question about LinkedIn and liking or commenting on other professionals' posts and yeah, possibly on the differences there with regular social media.
Has left the meeting.
So I think, Suzanne, to your question, that's a bit of a different platform and a different audience. And so, liking what another professional has posted, depending on what it is, of course, might be interpreted differently than liking, what another client does or, liking a product, for example, as Elaine talked about. But Elaine,
liking someone's dog,
Yeah.
We have to take this all with a grain of salt a little bit and use some critical judgment to determine what's appropriate and what's not. So we can't draw a fine line in the sand that says on this side you're okay and on that side you're not. Nor can we provide an exhaustive list of what you can like and what you can't. This is, stand by for a sec, Mel, if you continue answering. I'm going to have a look and see if I can find which question on the Q&As this is addressed in.
Yeah, and then we have a follow-up from Elise, which is a really good point to encourage the college to consider changing our view of social media from a popularity contest to a powerful form of digital marketing. I think, Elise, it's a good reminder. We do focus on the pain points. That's our job, to protect the public, but there's definitely recognition given to the power of digital marketing in the introduction of our policy documents. And so, I think it's important to say that we don't want to prevent people from being successful in their business, but we do want to make sure that it's done in a way that meets the public's expectation for ethical and safe care. Elaine, were you able to find that?
Yeah, Q5 of the social media Q&A does it does talk about the granularity of liking posts and the detailed nature of our seeming guideline there and how to interpret that a little bit better.
Perfect. And Miriam just wanted to confirm that reaching out to physician offices or businesses to discuss partnerships and providing
Has joined the meeting.
services is solicitation. I would think not. We are really talking about solicitation between a dietitian and a potential client, so a member of the public, not another health regulated professional. Any other questions? We went a little bit over time, wanting to answer as many questions as we'd like. But if there are any
Has
other
left the meeting.
Additional questions, please feel free to email us. We're available, as you know, and we will see if any of the questions are not included in our Q&As and add them in there to make sure that we're supporting you as well as we can.
Alana, the last slide has our contact information on it. If you could there, thank you.
Perfect. So thank you very much, everyone, for taking the time to attend this webinar, and we hope it was informative and answered some of the questions that were a long time getting clarified by the college, and we look forward to hear from you as we work with these new documents together.